Two tankers are moving through Omani territorial waters, flying the flag of the United Arab Emirates. Their names are Mombasa and Bahiyah. 46 crew members between them. 30 are Indian. Then two cruise missiles hit. Fire breaks out on both decks within minutes. One Indian seafarer is killed. At least 8 others are wounded, some critically. Signal number 1. This isn't a war headline about jets and generals. It's about ordinary men going to work on the water. Within hours, the UAE Ministry of Defense confirms it. Iranian cruise missiles, Omani waters. 2 national tankers hit in the same stretch of sea that carries roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas. Here's what nobody is telling you yet. The story doesn't end with the missiles. It barely begins there. Because thousands of miles away in New Delhi, a government that has spent 4 months trying to stay out of someone else's war now has 30 of its own citizens bleeding on burning ships. And it has to decide in real time what kind of country it wants to be. Not a bystander, not a combatant either, something in between. And that space in between is where this story actually lives. This is not the first time this exact scenario has played out either. That's signal number 3, and it matters more than people realize. Back in April 2024, Iranian Revolutionary Guard commandos rappelled from a helicopter onto an Israeli-linked container ship called the MSC Ares near this same stretch of water and seized it with 17 Indian crew members aboard. Months before that, a drone strike hit a chemical tanker called the Chem Pluto, roughly 200 nautical miles off India's own coast, and attacked the United States, attributed to Iran, which Tehran flatly denied. So by the time the Mombasa and Bahiyah caught fire on July 14th, India wasn't reacting to something new. It was reacting to the latest entry in a pattern that has been building for over 2 years. To understand why this strike landed the way it did, and why India responded the way it did, you have to rewind further than this one morning, not days, months. This war didn't start on July 14th. It started roughly 4 months earlier, when Israel and the United States launched strikes deep into Iranian territory, and the conflict escalated to a point almost nobody in the region had planned for. At one point during that stretch, strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Oil markets convulsed. Brent crude spiked past $79 a barrel in a single trading session on that news alone. Then came a ceasefire, a fragile one, brokered after nearly 4 months of open war, with both sides accusing each other of violations almost as soon as the ink dried. The Strait of Hormuz became the pressure valve for the entire conflict. Close it, and the world feels it within days. Iran understood that leverage from day one. At the height of the fighting, the strait was functionally shut. Tehran reportedly required military approval for any vessel to pass. On one particularly brutal day, only 4 ships were allowed through. Oil prices didn't just rise, they broke. WTI crude jumped more than 8% in a single session, its steepest one-day move in years, briefly touching triple digits. Then it dropped just as violently when a truce looked real, then spiked again when the truce looked fake. This is the rhythm the region has been living in for months. Hope, spike, ceasefire, violation, spike again. At one point, in the first 24 hours after a ceasefire was announced, only a single oil products tanker managed to transit the entire strait, according to reporting at the time. That's how tightly Iran was controlling the valve. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, reported its own oil production capacity had been cut by roughly 600,000 barrels a day after attacks on its energy infrastructure, and a pipeline specifically built to bypass Hormuz altogether was also struck during the fighting. In other words, even the workaround routes weren't safe. There was no clean way to move oil out of the Gulf without touching this conflict somewhere along the chain. By July, the ceasefire was still technically alive. Barely. And that's the world the Mombasa and the Bahiyah sailed into on the morning of July 14th. Here's the detail almost nobody outside shipping circles caught. In the weeks before this strike, the International Maritime Organization had already been forced to pause an evacuation plan for ships stranded around the strait, after another vessel reported being hit by an unidentified projectile near the Omani coast. That's signal number 2. This wasn't an isolated flashpoint. It was the second, maybe third warning shot in a pattern that regional shippers had already started bracing for. But here's the catch nobody had fully priced in yet. Iran's own explanation for the July 14th strike. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed, after the fact, that the tankers had ignored warnings and attempted to cross what it described as a mined transit route. Sit with that for a second. A mined route. In one of the most heavily trafficked commercial shipping lanes on Earth. Whether that claim is a justification invented after the fact, or a genuine warning that got lost in the chaos of wartime shipping, is still contested. But it tells you something important about where this conflict actually sits. It is no longer just missiles and jets. It is now about who controls passage through 60 miles of water that the global economy cannot function without. And 30 Indian citizens were caught directly in that contest, with zero say in how it was being fought. Now here's where the story pivots to New Delhi. Because This is where responded without firing a shot actually starts to make sense. And it is not the story of inaction people assume it is. India had no warships engaging Iranian vessels that morning, no missiles launched in retaliation, no naval blockade ordered. What India did instead was move through the machinery of diplomacy, fast and with precision most viewers watching cable news would never notice. Within hours of the strike, India's Ministry of External Affairs summoned Iran's Deputy Chief of Mission in New Delhi, a diplomat named Mohammad Javad Hosseini. The meeting was led not by India's foreign minister, not by a headline-grabbing cabinet figure, but by a joint secretary, the official specifically responsible for the Iran desk, a man named Anand Prakash. That choice of rank was not an accident. It was a message in itself, high enough in the hierarchy to signal that India was genuinely furious, low enough to avoid the appearance of a full diplomatic rupture with Tehran. This is shuttle diplomacy in its quietest form, not planes crossing continents, but a single meeting inside South Block, calibrated down to the exact rank of the officials in the room. India's spokesperson, Randhir Jaiswal, then went public. The government condemned the attacks and the broader targeting of seafarers and commercial shipping, explicitly framing free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz as something the entire world depends on, not just India. No threats, no warships repositioned toward the Gulf on camera, no retaliatory rhetoric, just a formal, documented public protest, delivered directly to the country responsible. To some viewers, that will look weak. It wasn't. Here's the domino effect almost nobody explains properly. India imports the overwhelming majority of its crude oil. A huge share of it transits the exact waterway that just got hit. In the first quarter of this fiscal year alone, India's oil import bill jumped to roughly $60 billion, up from about $45 billion during the same quarter a year earlier, driven largely by the price volatility the same conflict has been causing all year. If India had escalated militarily, even symbolically, it risks turning itself into a party to a war it has zero interest in fighting. Its navy could be drawn into an active conflict zone. Its shipping insurance costs could spike overnight. Its energy security, already strained, could become genuinely precarious. If the strait closes entirely, even briefly, the math is brutal. Oil could spike toward the triple digits again, and India, which imports the vast majority of its energy, absorbs that shock almost immediately, at the pump, in inflation, in its currency. So India chose the other lever. Diplomatic pressure, applied precisely, aimed at both Tehran and the broader international community, without adding a single new combatant to an already combustible region. That's not passivity. That's a country doing cost-benefit math in real time, with human lives and a national economy both on the table simultaneously. Consider the alternative for a second. India does maintain a credible navy with a real presence in the wider Indian Ocean region, and it has run escort and reassurance patrols for its shipping before, in other crises. It had that option available, but sending naval assets toward an active missile exchange between Iran and the Gulf states would have converted a diplomatic protest into something that looks, from Tehran's side, like a military signal. And once a country injects its navy into someone else's war zone, walking that back gets exponentially harder. Restraint, in this specific case, wasn't the absence of a response, it was the response, chosen deliberately over the louder and more dangerous alternative sitting right there on the table. But the story doesn't stop at India's front door. There's friction on every other side of this conflict too, and it's worth naming, because it explains why nobody fully trusts this ceasefire to hold. On the Israeli side, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly maintained that ongoing operations against targets in Lebanon fall entirely outside the scope of the U.S.-Iran truce, a position Washington has had to separately negotiate around, scheduling additional talks specifically to address that gap. That's a hardliner position embedded directly inside a ceasefire that was already fragile before this tanker strike happened. On the Iranian side, the same Revolutionary Guard units controlling passage through Hormuz are the ones setting the terms, reportedly even floating a toll system, charging ships for the right to pass through waters that international law says should be free and open to everyone. Even the American side of the truce has had public friction. At one point, during the negotiations, the ceasefire extension itself was still awaiting presidential sign-off in Washington, even as both militaries had already exchanged fire hours earlier. A Revolutionary Guard strike on a U.S. airbase, met by Iranian ballistic missiles fired toward Kuwait that were intercepted before impact. That's the texture of this ceasefire in one snapshot. Two militaries trading strikes in the morning, diplomats still trying to finalize the paperwork on the truce that was supposed to stop exactly that by the afternoon. Neither side is fully unified behind de-escalation. And that's exactly the environment the Mombasa and Bahiyah sailed into. Here's the third person nobody mentions when they tell this story. Oman. The strike happened inside Omani territorial waters. Not international waters. Not Iranian waters. Omani waters. Oman has spent years quietly positioning itself as the least hostile channel between Washington, Tehran, and Gulf shipping interests, a mediator nobody names publicly, but almost everybody relies on when direct lines go cold. That detail matters more than it looks like on the surface. It means every actor in this story, Iran, the UAE, India, the United States, has to route concerns through, or at least around, a fourth government that didn't ask to be a battlefield. Muscat didn't fire a missile. It also didn't stop one from landing in its own waters. That's the quiet, uncomfortable position small Gulf states have been stuck in for months. Hosting a great power conflict they have almost no ability to control, in waters they're nominally sovereign over. There's a second, less visible domino here too: shipping insurance. Every time a tanker gets hit in or near the strait, war risk premiums for vessels transiting that corridor tend to climb. And that cost gets passed straight down the chain, to shipping companies, to oil traders, and eventually to the price you pay at a fuel pump thousands of miles away. The International Maritime Organization had already been forced to pause an evacuation plan for ships stranded near the strait once before this summer, after a separate vessel reported being struck by an unidentified projectile off the Omani coast. More than 200 vessels, including oil and gas tankers, were reported anchored near the passage at the height of the tension, simply waiting for a green light that never fully arrived. That's the unglamorous reality behind every oil prices surge headline. It isn't abstract market panic. It's real ships, fully loaded, sitting still in dangerous water because nobody can guarantee their crews will make it through in one piece. Now back to the human cost, because it's easy to lose the seafarers themselves in all this geopolitics. Of the 12 Indian nationals aboard one of the two tankers, one was killed and another injured. On the second vessel, 9 of the 18 Indian crew members were hurt, 2 of them seriously. These are not soldiers, they are merchant sailors. The invisible workforce that keeps roughly 90% of global trade moving, people who signed contracts to move cargo, not to sail into an active missile corridor. India has tens of thousands of its citizens working on commercial vessels across the wider Gulf region at any given time. This single morning is a reminder of exactly how exposed that workforce has become since this war began. And it isn't just Indians on these ships. Among the wounded on the Mombasa were 2 Ukrainian nationals as well, a small detail that says something larger. The Gulf's merchant fleets are staffed by a genuinely global workforce, and a strike on any tanker in this corridor spreads risk across multiple nations at once, whether those nations are involved in the underlying conflict or not. By the time this strike happened, Indian government sources were already tracking a grim running total. More than a dozen Indian nationals killed, and several more still missing across various incidents in the Gulf since roughly the end of February this year alone. This wasn't a one-off tragedy. It was the newest line in a growing ledger. And that's the quiet stakes running underneath every headline about oil prices and diplomatic summons. Real families in India, right now, waiting on updates about relatives they can't reach, on ships that were simply doing their jobs in the wrong stretch of water on the wrong morning. So where does this actually go next? The ceasefire between the US and Iran is still technically in effect, but it has already been accused of violations by both sides, repeatedly in the weeks leading up to this strike. The Strait of Hormuz has opened and closed like a valve throughout this entire conflict, sometimes handling normal traffic, sometimes reduced to a handful of vessels a day under military approval. Global shippers are watching this exact stretch of water more closely than almost anywhere else on Earth right now, because it is simultaneously the most important oil choke point on the planet and one of the most unpredictable pieces of geography in an active, unresolved conflict. India's calculation, protest loudly, escalate nothing, depends entirely on this ceasefire holding at least well enough that Indian shipping and Indian citizens aren't repeatedly caught in the crossfire. If it holds, even shakily, expect more of exactly what you just saw. Summoned diplomats, formal protests, careful language about international law, and India continuing to thread a needle between economic dependence on Gulf oil and its own citizens' safety on Gulf waters. If it breaks down further, the domino effect compounds fast. A fully closed strait pushes oil prices toward levels the global economy hasn't sustained in years. India's import bill, already climbing, spikes again. And the tens of thousands of Indian seafarers still working across that region become, once again, the most exposed people in a conflict none of them chose to be part of. That's the choice sitting on the table right now in the next handful of days. Not abstractly, concretely, for shipping lanes, for oil markets, and for the families still waiting on word from the Mombasa and the Bahiyah. A ceasefire that holds, however imperfectly, or a strait that closes again and drags everyone dependent on it, India included, straight back into the war zone by proxy. Peace, held together by a handful of careful diplomats in quiet rooms. Or escalation, decided by whichever hardliner on whichever side blinks first. Right now, nobody outside those rooms actually knows which one it's going to be.